Hi everyone and welcome to my Strathmore workshop. My name is Myriam Tillson and I am a French gouache and watercolor artist. Thank you for joining me for this 4-part course on painting with gouache. I hope you will find it useful and interesting. This workshop will be divided into 4 videos. In this first installment, this video, I will go over the essential characteristics of gouache, a brief overview of how it compares to watercolor and acrylic, the ideal basic supplies to get started with it, including brushes and paper, and I will also briefly cover what might make a good basic starting set of paints. The second video will cover 3 essential gouache techniques, and each technique will come with exercises that will help you gain a better understanding of the medium and will let you get more familiar with it. And then the last 2 videos in the series will be paint-along demonstrations. The first demo will go into how gouache can be used as a sketching and practice tool, and we will paint a landscape. And the second demo will be about using gouache for a more in-depth finished piece, and we'll practice painting an eye. So first, let's talk a little bit about what gouache is. So gouache is traditionally a water-soluble medium that can be used very opaquely, dries quickly, has a matte finish, and can be reactivated with water once dry. The mediums it is most commonly compared to are watercolor and acrylics. It is commonly referred to as opaque watercolor because it has a much higher coverage than regular watercolor due to the size of the pigment particles in the paint, which are much bigger in gouache than in watercolor. Aside from the size of the pigment particles and the fact that gouache has a higher concentration of pigment to binder, gouache and watercolor are pretty similar in composition, although some brands also add white pigment or chalk to their gouache to make it less transparent. Usually, the more high quality the gouache, the less white pigment will have been added to it. Similarly to watercolor, gouache is water-soluble and can be reactivated with water once dried, although some specific brands of gouache, usually called acrylic gouache, dry in a more similar way to acrylics in that they cannot be reactivated. Gouache can be used in a transparent way similar to watercolors, but its strength definitely lies in its opacity capabilities, in that it's more similar to acrylics. It can be fairly easily layered, mistakes can be corrected in ways that watercolor doesn't really allow, and we can work from dark to light as well as from light to dark, as it's easy to add highlights at the end in a way that isn't possible when using just watercolor. Gouache dries a lot more matte than acrylics, however, and as I mentioned before, it can be reactivated once dry, which acrylics can't. Gouache also dries faster than any of the 2 other mediums I mentioned, which makes it very convenient when sketching on the go or when you want to work quickly. So as you can see, gouache is a pretty convenient mix between watercolor and acrylics, demonstrating and combining key characteristics from both mediums, but also add its own personal touch to the mix. Gouache can be used either fresh from the tube, which is the best way to achieve the highest coverage, or it can also be dried in a pan and reactivated when needed, which can make it a little more difficult to achieve high opacity, although it is possible. But it makes the medium more convenient to carry around, obviously, and it means that you don't have to throw away your palette at the end of the day, because dried paints can still be used and don't have to be wasted. You can also use a combination of both techniques, reactivating any leftover paints in your palette and then topping up with fresh paints if you want more opacity. So now let's move on to talking about the kind of supplies that are ideal to use with gouache. Gouache is a pretty forgiving medium that can be used on a much bigger variety of surfaces than watercolor, but like any other medium, some brushes and papers help it achieve its full potential better than others. Gouache can be used on wood, board, glass, plastic, you name it, because it sits on top of the surface rather than sink into it as much as watercolor does. It does not necessarily require a very absorbent surface to work well, but it still is a water-based media, and so it does perform its best on paper. Gouache requires less water than watercolor, so it can be used more easily on thinner papers, but like with any water-soluble medium, the thicker the paper, the easier a time you will have. To minimize the chances of your paper warping and buckling, it's usually best to use sheets over 300 grams in weight. If you plan on using quite a few layers and working your paper surface quite a bit, try to use watercolor or mixed media paper, as they just withstand abuse better generally and don't break apart. In my opinion, cold pressed watercolor paper is ideal with gouache, as the tooth, the texture of the paper, helps the paint grab onto the surface more easily and prevents the paint from sliding around too much. If you don't like using textured paper, you can also find hot press watercolor paper, which is smoother. Another good option is mixed media paper. It usually has a lot less texture than watercolor paper and tends to be cheaper, and it can be wonderful with gouache. Keep in mind that it can be a little more tricky to master gouache on smooth paper if you are not very familiar with the medium, especially if you are not super comfortable with judging the amount of water in your paint yet. Smooth paper can make it a little bit more difficult to achieve an even paint effect and can lead to your paint sliding around a little if there is a lot of water in it, so it can be a bit more frustrating to learn gouache when working on untextured paper, but it's obviously down to personal preference and exactly what you like to use. In this series, I will be using some mixed media paper, including the Strathmore Series 400 mixed media papers in a few different colours. Coloured paper is a great way to practice gouache, especially when you want to try and work opaquely. So some of our exercises in the next video will be on new Strathmore black mixed media paper, although they can also be done on normal white paper, obviously. So now let's talk a little bit about brushes. Once again, gouache can be used in so many different ways that you can experiment with all sorts of brushes to get a feel of what works for you. The brushes you want to use will depend on the techniques you like the most, but since I will be focusing on using gouache in an opaque manner in this series, I'll be telling you about the brushes I personally think work great for this. Generally, I personally prefer mixed media or acrylic brushes when working with gouache, rather than watercolor brushes, because they carry less water in their bristles, and I find that that works best when working opaquely with gouache and allows for greater control over your water content. Watercolor brushes are great for washes and using gouache more transparently, but they obviously carry more water, so you run the risk of diluting your paint more than you intended. Plus, as gouache is a little rougher on brushes than watercolor, they tend to wear down quicker, and mixed media and acrylic brushes are less delicate than watercolor brushes, and cheaper a lot of the time too. And finally, acrylic brushes tend to be stiffer and less flexible than watercolor brushes, and therefore can hold more gouache, which is helpful when you want to work opaquely because the paint is a lot stiffer, so you need something that is also stiffer to use them with. If you are in the beginning process of learning gouache, I recommend experimenting with the size and type of brush you want to use, as the more you practice, the easier it will be for you to narrow down your favorites. However, I don't recommend starting with tiny brushes other than for the occasional tiny detail, as tiny brushes have the downside of making us focus on details rather than the bigger picture, which is often detrimental to the final result and the learning process. On the other hand, gouache isn't really ideal for massive paintings either. The tubes are quite small and can be quite expensive, especially in the beginning, so there is often no need for very big brushes other than to lay down the occasional background or underpainting, so medium-sized brushes are best in my opinion. I personally particularly like dagger, sword and angle brushes since I can get big flat areas of paint quickly down with them, but I can also work in detail with the tip and the blade when I need to. That is purely personal preference though. Overall, I would recommend mixed media or acrylic brushes and a mix of flat and round, ranging from 10 to 4 in size approximately. For this series, I will be using Princeton brushes. I particularly like their Umbria range, which is an acrylic brush range, but I also have a few from their Aqua Elite range, which work great for both acrylic and watercolor, and a few of their mixed media Velvet Touch range also. As you can see, most of them are flat brushes in a few different sizes, and I also included a couple of pointed round brushes just to be a bit more comprehensive in my brush type. Do keep in mind that these are my personal preferences and that the techniques I'll be demonstrating in this video series can be practiced with any of your favorite brushes. Now let's talk a little bit about what would make up a good basic color kit. In my opinion, a good starting kit with gouache is a kit that includes a small number of good quality paints. I don't recommend the cheapest paints you can find because they are unlikely to be very enjoyable to paint with, and gouache is a medium that is easy to get frustrated with if it doesn't perform well. I don't think it's necessary to use the highest quality paints you can find either, especially if you are still not sure you will enjoy the medium. You don't want paints that intimidate you and that you're afraid of wasting on random exercises and the unavoidable failures of beginnings. If you can afford more expensive paints, then by all means go for it, but there are a lot of mid-range paints out there that are wonderful to learn and practice with. For this particular series, I will be using the Aquafine Gouache range from Daler-Rowney. It's good quality, affordable, and has a good range of colours to choose from. When it comes to colour selection, a good rule of thumb to avoid getting overwhelmed and to ensure an efficient learning experience is to select a varied but limited colour palette. Having a limited amount of colours will force you to learn about your colours and get a better grasp of colour mixing, an essential skill for any painter. It will also help you avoid the mental clutter that can go with having too many choices. Plus, it's cheaper and easier to carry around, so I strongly recommend focusing on getting a limited range of good quality paints instead of a more extensive range of lower quality colours. So the main colour that you will need if you want to paint with gouache will be white. You will often be using a lot of white, and white tubes are often available in bigger sizes than the average colour tube, so I recommend getting a big tube of opaque white, also called titanium white. Another good staple to have in any basic painting kit is black. I don't personally use it extensively with gouache, so I don't think a big tube is needed, but having a regular tube of it is always useful. Other than those two basic colours, I will be choosing 10 more. That number is fairly arbitrary, so do feel free to adapt your basic palette as you like. Make sure to not overwhelm yourself with too many colour variants though. A good rule of thumb for basic colour selection is to choose a warm and a cool version of each primary colour. If you don't know how to differentiate between warm and cool within a hue yet, don't worry, you can just pick a single primary. Having both a warm and cool version of a colour gives you more flexibility in the colours you can mix with them, but it isn't a deal breaker if you don't have them either. If you want to learn a little bit more about cool and warm colours, you can go in the downloadable worksheet that comes with this video, and I explain it a tiny bit more in there. So for this series, I will go with lemon yellow as my cool yellow and cadmium yellow hue as my warm yellow. I also have alizarin crimson as my cool red and cadmium red hue as my warm red, as well as ultramarine blue dark as my warm blue and phthalo blue as my cool blue. So once you have your primaries picked out, feel free to add any extra colours you like or feel like you'll be using a lot of. I personally have a soft spot for Payne's Grey. I use it extensively, often as a substitute for black. I tend to use it when I want to darken a colour mix instead of black. Black just has a tendency to be flattening and dulling for any colour mix. I like black for very intense darks in my piece, but rarely to mix it with other colours. I like to use Payne's Grey for that instead. I also like to have an ochre type colour as it's very versatile and it often comes in handy when painting skin tones, so I went for raw sienna for this kit, and then I added a cool and a warm brown, raw umber and burnt sienna. I find earthy colours to be very useful and versatile. So that's my basic kit made up. In order to keep this series coherent and beginner friendly, I will be sticking to this kit when I paint, and I'll let you know which colours I am using as I go. Do remember, however, that nothing stops you from getting the colours you prefer. White is a must in my opinion, and primaries are ideal, but other than that, it's up to you. In my demos, I will be mixing whatever colours I need that aren't already in my kit, but if you don't feel comfortable doing that yet, do feel free to pick a tube of an equivalent hue if you have one instead. And so I think that's it for our first installment for this course. Join me next time for some basic techniques and exercises to get you painting and help you become more comfortable with gouache. And in the meantime, take care everyone, and I'll see you very soon.